I think there's two main things that any educational leader should be really, really thinking hard about right now. And one of them is, do the teachers in your organization teach content or teach kids? We aligned high stakes test data to teacher quality. Teachers started teaching content because that's how they were rated. And if we measure it, it matters, right? So it shifted that focus. And what we need is teachers to teach kids.
Welcome to another episode of Hall Pass to Nowhere. Today, our guest is a pioneer in the field of educational neuroscience who believes that to truly reach a student's mind, we must first understand their biology. As the CEO of the Educational Partnership Institute and author of the groundbreaking book, NeuroWell, she has spent her career helping educators move from a compliance mentality to a collaborative commitment. She doesn't just look at what a student is doing. She looks at what is happening inside their brain to understand why they are doing it. From her work in school districts across the country to her development of the JACAPA tracking system, she is transforming classrooms into environments where students don't just survive, they thrive. Please welcome the architect of the NeuroWell Culture, Dr. Lisa Riegel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. That was a nice introduction.
No worries. No worries. I'm excited for you to be here. Very much so. I am a special education teacher. And so much of my work, on top of, getting them to meet the academic deficits that are specifically mentioned in the IEP, but so much of my work is trying to go deeper, or trying to figure out what's going on, or trying to understand the child in a different capacity than maybe some of my general education peers. So I'm very much excited to speak with you. Tell us a little bit about NeuroWell. Let's just start there. NeuroWell, I want you to take us from the idea to NeuroWell currently and how it's operating and the why behind it.
Sure. So I was a teacher for 9 years, and then I was an administrator for a couple of years. And I always had a heart for the at-risk kids. And what I started to realize was that nothing we were doing was working. And when I started doing consulting work back in 2008, I did a lot of professional development with teachers on how to set up student-centered classrooms and kind of more in the curriculum end of things. And then I worked with the state of Ohio to develop their procedural safeguards manual. So I started really getting into the special education realm from a policy perspective. And what I started to realize is that following the timelines and filling out the forms was one aspect, but like the quality wasn't there. And then as a parent, my son's twice exceptional. So he is super smart, but he has really wicked ADD. So school was tough for him. And so when we went in finally in 5th grade, we had an IEP meeting, and I was amazed because I looked at the IEP and I'm like, this is not aligned at all with the evaluation report and what it had to say. So I started asking questions, and I started realizing they had no idea. They didn't know. Like I said, at one point, I said, well, what's fluid reasoning? Didn't know. And I said, well, what did he have to do on the test in order to score the way he scored on these various things? They couldn't tell me what he had to do. And the psych wasn't there that day. And so it was this eye-opening moment for me where I was like, we are dealing with the brain. We're dealing with kids' sense of self, their concept. I mean, we have a lot of power to really lift them up or to rip them down. And so that started getting me on the journey of really the thinking skills, like getting away from content and really thinking about the brain. Then I started really diving into the actual neuroscience because I was been working with several separate facility schools. I work in a juvenile detention center. And I was like, there's a lot going on in this brain. And really our behavior, I started becoming kind of a behavior person. Schools were calling me in to do interventions and help them with their toughest kids. And so I started to really think about, behavior is really the intersection of our biology and our context. So as educators, if we understand the biology, we reframe the problem. This isn't he just doesn't want to do it or poor character or things like that. There's biology going on. And then ultimately, as educators, we can control the context. So what context can we create that can actually change the brain, can actually make it better and work with not just executive functions, but emotional regulation and some of the other issues that cause problems for students. So that was really kind of the impetus for doing it. And then since then, I work in schools. I do keynote addresses. I do professional development, but I really I take like maybe 5 or 6 schools a year and I go really deep dive and I roll up my sleeves and I get to know the kids that are struggling. I get to know the staff really well. And I coach them through how do you start this transition into a NeuroWell culture? Because at the end of the day, it's better for the teachers too. They're happier, they're healthier, they're more productive, they're not dysregulated. Because if you have a dysregulated teacher, you don't have a regulated classroom.
Wow. Well said. Well said. So, oh man, I agree. You don't know how much I agree with that statement right there. How much.
Yeah.
You differentiate between regulation and motivation issues. And I think many teachers, and I will say even myself included, at some points, and obviously I'm human, even depending on the day, I might have trouble differentiating that. Why is this distinction critical?
Good question. So I created, it's called the wheel of positivity. Mm-hmm. And on the outside of the wheel is motivation, meaningful performance, and feedback. And then inside the wheel are the cogs that we have to move the wheel forward. And they're the biggest one's relationships. And then it's teaching, how you teach. And then the third is celebrations. We miss that positivity. And so when you think about motivation, sometimes we're not motivated because it's an equation. It's called the expectancy value equation. Okay. So if I expect to do well and I value what I'm doing, then I will be motivated. So for example, I love gardens. I think they're beautiful, but I kill everything. I do have a house plant named Melvin that I've kept alive for 3 years. And everyone in my family is like, he's still here. And I'm like, he is. So I've had a lived experience of failure. And so when I look at gardens, I'm like, well, I value them, but my expectancy's down here. It's easier to bring the value down than it is to bring the expectancy up. So we see this in schools a lot of times, especially, if you've got kids who have behavior problems, they've missed a lot of class. They get thrown out, those gaps get bigger and bigger. And so one of the pieces of NeuroWell talks about intellectual safety and feeling like you walk in the room and you can do it. And I'll talk to teachers about your morning work. Like the very first thing they do in the morning is you can't do this. And if you know your students and you know your students aren't capable of doing what you've got in front of them yet, then you're sending the message to them like, welcome, I'm glad you're here. I'm going to have you sit here and just feel dumb for 15 minutes while everybody else gets their work done. And then their emotional regulation system kicks off. So the emotional regulation system is separate, but it's very much tied to what we're motivated to do based on our level of expectancy.
Wow. And you talked about those students getting removed from class and that gap getting bigger. And I'm trying to think how to phrase this in an appropriate manner, but I'll say it like this. I feel like there has been enough research and enough PDs to bring that to our attention. Mm-hmm. So why is that still our go-to when we have a difficult student or a student that may be dealing with something? Why is it still our go-to to remove them from the classroom?
I think part of the reason is because they don't understand the importance of context to our behavior. So one of the things I talk about in schools is if you have a kid in your class who's acting out and you send them somewhere else, you've changed the context. So that kid goes to a context and is completely regulated and fine and ready to go, but they're entering back into a polluted context. And if you're my teacher and you and I've had a disagreement, there's conflict that's unresolved. And so how do we resolve that conflict? Because if you've ever been in a fight with somebody or had an issue with a friend or a spouse or anything else, the next time you see them, if it hasn't been resolved, there's that like thing hanging there, right?
Yes.
And that thing is unknown. Like, how are we going to proceed? And so the way our brain works with perceptions is we have down in our thalamus. So we have so much information that's going on below our nose in our brain, and all of that part of our brain is unconscious. So when we think about perceptions, that happens in the limbic brain, and it's your thalamus. And the thalamus's job is to look at all the different stuff in the environment and to kind of say, hey, are we safe or not? Because this part of our brain's about keeping us alive. This part of our brain is about who we are, right? So the thalamus will say, okay, we're here, and this is what I can pull from our sensory memories of the past. And so if I've had a lived experience of negativity in schools, then the minute I walk into the school, all the sensory data is the same, and my brain's going to go, this is like that. So we need to be a little bit stressed because this isn't a positive place where I feel good, right? So I think when teachers understand the biology piece, that what they are seeing in their classroom has everything to do with the culmination of past experiences and how the brain has organized those experiences. And it may have almost nothing to do with what's going on in the moment. And I use this analogy because it's easy to visualize. The thalamus goes into sensory memories in our brain. And we think of our brain as having like a library of memories. You go get a card catalog, pull it out and read it. That's not how the memories are stored. They're fragmented and stored all over in different parts of our brain. Like procedural memories, different than sensory memory, different than semantic memory. So when we create a semantic memory, or one that has meaning to us, the prefrontal cortex of our brain has to go into all of these different sections, pull up all this information, and do some information processing. So when we're stressed, we can't do that. So our limbic system's just basically taking over. So I think when teachers understand that what they're seeing in the classroom isn't necessarily a product of what's happening right now. It's whatever the conditions are that are going on, it's being associated in that brain as something that needs to stress me out. And then once they understand that, and they understand, okay, how can I build a context that's safe emotionally and intellectually, that's supportive, and that shares power and builds agency in students. And I can share a little bit with you about how behavior plans miss the mark on this. And then finally, proactive. And I'll say to teachers of elementary, I'm like, okay, so can you predict that kids are going to roll around the carpet and poke each other? And they're like, of course. And I'm like, then why are you angry when they do? You know. So how can you be proactive to take the general need, I need to move, and to give them positive ways that are acceptable in a classroom to meet that need.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a word that even made me perk up even more, and that's how behavior plans are missing the mark. And that's going to be part B. Let's focus on part A right now. Part A is going to be when you mentioned, how removing the student changes the context, and then they come back and it's a polluted context. It's kind of like you have that thing, you have that friction. Mm-hmm. This is probably the $1 million question for part A. How do teachers and student change the context to move past that friction?
Yep. So we have to resolve the conflict, right? And part of it is the teacher has to be part of the solution. It can't be, I teach, and if you don't do what I want you to do, you have to go to a principal that's going to manage punishment, right? So one of the things I've done in schools is if a kid's acting up, unless they're like throwing things and out of control and a safety issue kind of thing, if a student is disengaged or they're being combative or they're whatever, a teacher can call an administrator to the room. The administrator comes into the room and watches the students, and the teacher and the student go in the hallway and have a conversation. And, that conversation's like, hey, what's going on right now? How can I help? As opposed to, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. Because people don't like to be out of control. And what I see is a lot of students who are emotionally out of control, and it shows up in all different kinds of behaviors. So if the teacher comes out from a supportive lens and says, hey, you're having a tough time today. How can I help? What's going on? And making sure that they regulate them first, because if they're talking to them when the kid's still escalated, they're talking to this part of the brain. That's why if you ever have a fight and then you calm down, you're like, why did I say that? Like, that's not even me. Why did I even go there? It's because this part of your brain. So what happens is you've got your thalamus. It's the data manager. It's taken in all the information. It sends a report to your amygdala, which is your security monitor. And it says either, hey, we're in danger, we're not in danger. The security manager decides, do I just tap the button? And if he taps the panic button, a message is immediately sent up here to the reasoning part of our brain that says, hey, we've got kind of conflicting interpretations of our reality. So what's really going on? And so that keeps you here, and it keeps your brain functioning. If the person wails on the button, if your security manager wails on that button, basically the message that goes to the you part of your brain says, hey, we're in danger. Go get a cup of coffee. We don't need you right now. We're going to take over until the danger is over. And so kids get into this rabbit, just constant, like, I'm always stressed out, so I'm not thinking, I do dumb things, so then I get stressed out again. And then you end up in a state of fear. So the body has 4 states. It has calm, and then it has alert. Alert is when you just tap that button. And that's actually good for you. It's like before you give a speech or before you take a test or a job interview or something. It focuses you. This part of your brain is hyper-focused on, let me manage this situation, because it's not sure if it's dangerous or not. So it's a good stress. When you move to alarm is when that has been wailed on. And then if you're always hitting that button, panic button, the button gets much more sensitive. And so you start seeing threats where there aren't any. And then you end up in this constant state of fear. And at that point, you can't learn, you can't think, your executive functions aren't firing, and you end up causing your own problems. It becomes a cycle.
Wow. Okay. So we're going to continue down this path, but we have to take a quick little sidebar, detour, whatever you want to call it, because you specifically mentioned, and we can talk about how behavior plans essentially aren't working or aren't really addressing what they need to address properly. I'll say it like that to be polite. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So behavior plans right now are set up like tattletale plans in most places I see. You have commands of the student listened, the student paid attention, the student did what he was told. And, those send a message that school is about compliance and conformity.
Yeah.
And all you're doing is confirming the obvious. If the kid's on a behavior plan, it's probably because they are regularly disruptive, right? So it's fine to have that type of data collection system for the teacher, as if you're trying to decide if they need a behavior therapist or if they need an IEP or whatever. But that data should never be shown to the student. And so what I propose instead is you want a behavior plan that builds a sense of agency in the student. So the way that we build habits in our mind is like a giant highway, and it has all these on and off ramps, and those on and off ramps become automatic. So some people, as adults, I'm stressed, I'm going to drink. Or I'm stressed, I'm going to eat, or you're making me mad, so I'm going to scream at you and win, right? Those are automatic ramps, and those ramps form through years and years of repetition. So if you think of when you're born, your brain's like a giant field of grass, and then you, through repeated actions, you start to tamp down that grass and create these automatic neural pathways, or these exit ramps. Well, if we're asking a kid to do a new exit ramp, and I always use the example, it's January, so everybody's trying to lose weight. So say you and I said, okay, we're going to try to get healthy, eat healthier, lose some weight. So instead of going to the Mexican restaurant and, slugging down 2 margaritas and 3 bags of chips, why don't we go to the vegetable restaurant instead? So we say, okay, so that's the first thing, is, do I know where to go instead? Because if I said to you, let's go to the Golden Corral, that's not a good choice. We're just subbing one bad thing for another, right? We make the assumption that kids know where to go instead, and they don't. And so we have to carve for them a new exit ramp that's a goal. We're going to go here instead of there. Then we have to practice. We have to have repetition over time. And when our brain is carving a new path, just like it takes equipment and gasoline and everything else to pave a highway exit ramp, it takes a ton of energy out of our brain to pave a new highway ramp. And it takes that persistence over time. And the key is, it takes tenacity to forgive ourselves. And behavior plans currently don't forgive people. So, because like you and I will end up at the Mexican restaurant at some point, right? But the question then is when we're sitting there after we're done and we're starting to feel guilty about it, is do I say to you, okay, this was fun, but we're going to get back on the horse. We're going to go to the vegetable restaurant next time. And you say, yeah, okay, we're going to do that. Or I say, you know what? We were never meant to be healthy eaters. That's not who we are. So let's just come back here next week, right? And that's what happens in behavior plans is we set up some interventions, we log data on the failures, and then when it doesn't work, we're like, well, that kid's just not going to behave. And we go backwards. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. And so the other piece too that's important is it takes energy to make changes. And the way that we fuel motivation and continued energy is through positivity. If we went on a weight loss bend and I lost 20 pounds and not one person says you look nice or did you lose some weight or reinforce that, then it just kind of fizzles because it's like, why am I doing all this work for no effort?
Right.
And so when I do behavior plans, I call them when-then plans. And the first step is I talk to the student about, what's going on when you get frustrated or what's happening? Can we look for a pattern? Because it's not, and this is the other thing I see in education, it's not about the what, it's about the why. And so, for example, I get super anxious when I'm late. It has nothing to do with time. It has to do that growing up, my parents were divorced. I had to wait for my dad. He was a serial late person. And so I spent a ton of time on the front stoop waiting. My brain in that sensory association, which is unconscious, it linked the emotional impact of feeling like I wasn't important or feeling like I wasn't loved or things like that with lateness. So my body, if I'm running late, my brain doesn't say, oh, I'm running late, I should get stressed. My body just does that because it's going through those sensory folders, right? So by understanding the fear underneath the action, it can help. So if a student has a low frustration tolerance, what's the real fear? Is there fear being dumb? Or is there fear being in trouble? Or is there fear being confirming the family narrative that they're the dumb kid? Or, what's going on in their brain that's causing that? Because multiple triggers in our environment are going to be directed toward that fear. So understanding the fear rather than the situation is much more powerful. Once we do that, then I say, okay, so when I am feeling like I don't know what I'm doing, then what should I do? Because right now, when I'm feeling like I don't know what I'm doing, I dysregulate and I cause problems. What should I do instead? And giving them a concrete, it's kind of like the Golden Corral thing. We're not doing the Golden Corral. That's the same negative outcome. We're going to pick something that's positive that you can do. And I always tell teachers, make it visible, because then when you see them doing it, you can go and give them positive reinforcement in the moment that will give them a dopamine hit and will give them the energy to keep trying. So for example, one thing, kids who are super impulsive, one thing I recommend is that you do an intervention called the stop and think. And so I tell kids, okay, so when you're sitting, you're having a state of action. You're sitting down. If you stand up, you've changed your state of action. If you're quiet and then you start to talk, you're changing your state of action. So what I want you to practice is anytime you're getting ready to change that, go stop and think, like make jazz hands, stop and think. What that does is it stops your brain for a split second. It makes your motor center fire. It makes your internal language center fire. So it gives you that little bit of a moment. It also is visual. So if I'm a teacher and I've got a kid on a stop and think plan and he goes like this, I can go over and be like, what'd you just stop yourself from doing? And he'll be like, I was going to throw that chair. And I'm going to be like, but you didn't. And we high five and we celebrate in that moment. And if you're logging, then how often are you seeing that kid make attempts to do that other exit ramp? Then now all of a sudden you're giving them fuel and positivity and you're truly looking at behavior change. Where if you're only looking at whether they blew up, a kid might have a day where they blow up 5 times, but they stop themselves 100. That's a successful day versus maybe another day they just weren't all that stressed out and they only acted out 3 times. The way we collect data, we'd say that day with the 3 times was better than the one with the 5, and it wasn't.
That makes so much sense. Makes so much sense. Oh my goodness. It's like my brain is just firing all over the place.
Well, the other thing I think that's hard for kids, that have behavior problems is It's not just one thing. They have a whole series of things that are going on. And we go in and try to boil the ocean and fix everything.
Yeah.
And that's not how it works. Like, even think about teachers. If I came into your school and said, we're going to do these 6 new initiatives and you have to do all this work, people would be stressed beyond capacity. And we do that to kids, and it doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't align with the way the brain processes change or effort or fear.
Gotcha. In some of your research, you've mentioned the modern student's brain and how it's different from previous generations. Can you kind of just, I was going to specifically talk about the technology and environmental changes, but I just kind of want to just leave it a little bit more broad and just talk about how the modern student's brain is different from previous generations. Because I think anyone that's listening to this just needs to hear that in itself.
Right. And the important thing is that these contextual factors that students have grown up with in today's world are different than ours. And their brain has made different filters in that thalamus, right? So one of the reasons, there's a variety that I talk about in the book. But for example, I grew up, this will date me, but I grew up on Little House on the Prairie and Saved by the Bell and Happy Days, and shows that were about wholesomeness, about owning your mistakes, about respecting your parents, about, just about goodness, about, Little House on the Prairie, being good for the community, things like that. Today's kids grow up with The Housewives. They grow up with shows where the whole show, the winner is the one who manipulates. The winner is the one that votes the other people, that gets a group of people together to oust somebody else. We're immersed in that as if that's the world, right? And our brain creates a very strong filter from the time we're kids that says, is the world safe and predictable and are people generally kind? Or is the world dangerous and unpredictable and chaotic and are people generally not kind? And then everything that we have runs through those filters. And so we have that. And then on top of that, we have social media. And, social media is a real damage for kids' brains because they're in this like fake world. And, I don't go to the grocery store like hungover on a Sunday and take a snapshot and make it my profile picture. You curate them so that you look the best you can be and you're just a little bit better than you are in real life. And so when you think about how much time kids spend on, servers and platforms and all of those areas that are online where they have a persona, then they come to school and they're walking in knowing they're less than what they project. And that causes the brain to dysregulate. So the school anxiety level goes up. And then you look at like even parents. And if you go out to dinner and you look at a family, nobody's talking to each other. They're just on screens. And the important thing, like I had family dinners, they're boring, right? I don't want to sit and listen to my parents. But when I was a kid, you didn't get up and leave when it wasn't about you. You had to sit and listen. But what that taught my brain over many repetitions over years was how to listen to something I'm not necessarily immediately interested in, how to be curious, how to ask questions. And it also modeled for me, as they talked about the ups and downs of the day, that like you can get through a down. Like it maybe starts out bad, but then it gets better. And so all these things that were modeled for us just by the way we lived. And then you have technology as well that the researchers call it cognitive offloading. So just like you and I don't memorize phone numbers anymore, which is great. We don't have to memorize phone numbers.
Right.
However, we're not getting multiple repetitions of using our working memory, which is an executive function. And so kids today struggle more than ever with math facts because that requires working memory. We go to the library. When I was a kid, I'd go to the library and I had a question. You had to go to a card catalog. You had to go to a spatially organized without a GPS little blue line to tell you how to get there. You had to skim the text. You had to pull a main idea out. Those are things that teachers bang their heads against the wall trying to get kids to learn how to do. We learned them because that's how you got information. But now you can just get it anywhere, so you don't need to do that. And I think AI is compounding that problem. Because the more we cognitively offload, the less our CEO gets practice. And just like any job, you get better as you do it. And so if we're not using that, then it gets worse. And then the one other one I'll say, there's a few other ones in the book, but the other one that just drives me nuts is that we live in a society today that is diseased, that views itself as diseased. If you watch TV, everybody in this country has a rash or diabetes or, issues with intimacy, whatever it is. Everybody's got these diseases, and it's
Right.
always about, go get a pill. So kids grow up in that, and they desperately want a diagnosis because they feel out of control. They know something's wrong, but they don't realize they have the power to change their brain and fix themselves. Now, I'm not saying some kids don't have mental health issues that are way beyond what I'm talking about, but the National Institute of Health came out with statistics. They misdiagnosed social anxiety at 97.8%.
Whoa.
Yes. Anxiety was up over 60%. And the problem is we go to the doctor today in this illness mindset and we say, I'm sad. And they say, oh, well, you have depression, so I'll put you on a medication. Or I'm nervous. Oh, well, you have anxiety. And they put you on. They're very fast to label things, right? The reality is that, like, I've talked to my kids about that. They're 20 and 23. And I'm like, everybody has anxiety in a social setting that's unfamiliar, right? Your brain is designed to make you feel anxious because survival requires that you're sharp and looking for danger. So we have kids now that our body from a biologic standpoint is at 4 different states of awake. So first there's calm, which is just calm. Then there's alert. And alert is like before a job interview or a football game or something where you're kind of amped up. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of stress going on, but it's good stress. And when your stress regulation system just kind of taps the button, you go into the alert phase. And it sends a message directly to here that's you that says, hey, we need you to think through this. We might be in danger. We might not. We're a little bit, but this part of your brain, the cognitive thinking, reasoning part of your brain is activated. If we push the button in our security system really hard, then the limbic system takes over and says, we're in danger. We're going to die. We're going to make sure that we preserve you. So it sends a message up here that says, hey, go get a cup of coffee. We're in danger. There's nothing you can do here. We're going to get our systems going so that we can escape this, and we'll let you know when it comes back. And we have kids today who go from calm to alarm. They don't know how to go from calm to alert. And I can't believe how many kids I meet who say, they give me all their diagnoses within like the first 5 minutes.
Yes.
And that's important because the way your brain works with perceptions is that in your thalamus, you have all these filters that are like, associations between your emotional state and sensory stimulus from the environment. So for example, if you're selling your house, you bake cookies or have a candle burning that smells like cookies. That sensory information in most people's brains is associated with home, with holidays, with family, with things that make you feel good. So we burn a candle in our house so that when people walk in, biologically, their body relaxes and they're like, oh, I could live here, right? So the way these filters work is that it's kind of like, I always use the example of like a spaghetti strainer, you put water through. If you have a banana and you put it in a strainer, and the banana represents reality, and you smash it through that filter, right, that colander. On the other side, it's still a banana, but it doesn't look anything like a banana. And so you and I can be at the same event, but our filters are different. And so our perceptions are going to look like different smashed up bananas. And so I think understanding that can also help teachers have a little bit of empathy that, again, what's happening now is only slightly related to what's happening now. It is everything related to how our brain is interpreting what's happening now with our entire host of past experiences.
So with that said, okay, a lot of researchers, scholars, teachers, administrators are having these conversations about different delivery of education, different types of delivery. In my personal experience, and it seems like we're still holding on to 90%, if not more, of the traditional education system. And we have plenty of research. We have plenty of administrators. We have plenty of scholars. We have plenty of information at this point, right? Mm-hmm. When are we going to start doing education different for the sake of our students?
Right. Well, I think there's 2 main things that any educational leader should be really, really thinking hard about right now. And one of them is, do the teachers in your organization teach content or teach kids? We aligned high stakes test data to teacher quality. Teachers started teaching content. because that's how they were rated. And if we measure it, it matters, right? So it shifted that focus. And what we need is teachers to teach kids. And so you can see it in a classroom within 5 minutes when you walk in, whether it's a content teacher or a kid teacher. So that's the one thing I would say is really to a leader, how are you, because what you measure matters. And if all you're hammering on is data all day, that's academic data, you're sending that message that that's all that matters. So how are we measuring? How are we observing? How are we reinforcing the actions that a teacher who teaches kids takes? So that's the first thing I think they should be thinking about. The second thing they need to be thinking about is that a lot of disengagement. I just read an article about this like a couple weeks ago, and they said it's not disengagement. It's they don't see relevance. So remember the wheel of positivity. We talked about the first part, which was that motivation. The second is meaningful performance. Why am I doing this? This isn't, I can have something else do this for me. And so when you think about why education was started to teach people to read so they could vote. Then we move to the Renaissance man, right? You go to school and you know a little bit about everything, and that makes you an educated human. Well, then the internet democratized data, so we didn't need to do that anymore. Then we shifted to its career readiness, pathways, career pathways, all of these things, certifications. But AI is disrupting the workforce in a way that no one can predict what's going to actually happen. And so now we've got all these pathways to nowhere. You've got the hall pass to nowhere. These are pathways to nowhere. And so my challenge for education leaders is, what is the purpose of school in a post-AI world? And to me, the purpose of school is to help people be happier, healthier, and more successful. It's about the human in the education, not the content. It's about teaching people to regulate. It's about teaching people self-awareness. It's about teaching thinking, teaching creativity, really focusing on the process of learning as opposed to the product of learning. And that shifts the way we do business if we believe that. So I'm working with a school right now. We have a priority framework, and the two main things we're working on. One is the NeuroWell culture that's safe, supportive, and proactive. So what are the routines and practices, the behavior plans? How are we addressing the culture? The second is, what do we need to be teaching? And we created a list of like 8 different things. Like, kids need to learn how to learn. They're never going to do that unless we give them a chance to do some metacognitive thinking about what they did. They need to learn how to socially engage. They need to learn how to love. They need to learn, all of these different kinds of things they need to learn. And the question that I have for the schools that I work with is, we have scopes and sequences, we have assessments, we have all of these different things that we do to make sure we're teaching content. But what do we have to show we're teaching thinking and teaching humans? And so I actually developed a software called Jacapa. It measures, trains, and tracks 32 skills in 5 areas. And it's kind of like a fitness tracker for your brain. Because again, your brain learns through repetition, experience, and emotion. You have to do it bunches of times until it's automatic. And so what the software does is there's a positivity activity to try to help put more of those positive folders in that thalamus. Because I always say the solution to pollution is dilution. So the more positivity we bring in, the more that when sensory data comes in, that thalamus is going to send a note that says, hey, don't hit the panic button hard, just tap it. So it's going to keep this part of our brain in the, CEO desk. The second one is around journaling, and it's about expressive communication. How do we talk? There's a stress management where you can go through and log how stressed you are, what are things you're trying, and get some data. And then there's a goal attainment one about helping you to have that persistence to attain goals. And you can put whatever you want in there. You can select or you can put whatever you want. So that kind of approach then yields data. So I've had lots of schools that are excited about using Jacapa because now they have a data point to say, are we growing the humans in our system instead of just growing their content or skill-based knowledge?
Absolutely. And so this Jacapa you're talking about, it can track up to 32 essential skills.
Yeah, there's 32 skills. So each week you focus, there's 5 different domains. So there's the self-management, which is kind of like executive function.
Right.
There's innovation, which is your thinking, like creativity, abstract thinking. There's a emotional resilience that's like independence, adaptability, anger management. There's a social engagement, which is communication related skills. And then there's a cooperation, which is really around teamwork. And that framework was not us. We worked with the University of Illinois Bessie Research Group,
Okay.
and they did this huge crosswork. We have like 200 different taxonomies and frameworks to talk about, durable skills, essential skills, soft skills, people skills, SEL skills. And we all, it's like you're saying tomato, I'm saying tomato.
Right.
So they basically said, what are we talking about? And they got it down to these 32 kind of key skills. And so we built the system around that. There's assessments, there's self-assessments, there's peer assessments, and then there's this daily kind of Fitbit sort of model. And then at the end of the week, they can go into their data and help like make some insights out of it. Like, do I see patterns here? And again, my big mission in life is I truly believe from the bottom of my heart, if we are self-aware and if we can be self-regulated, we have self-control. And when we have self-control, we make better decisions, we have better relationships, and we're healthier people because we're keeping our CEO in control instead of letting this part of our brain hijack our decision making.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when we're talking about brain science, right, I think some teachers may confuse that for just good old fashioned discipline or good old fashioned being strict or, whatever, adjective or verb or whatever you want to, interchange there. How do we, explicitly get our teachers, especially our veteran teachers, to understand that no, we really need to focus on the brain science and the why and the root and not the symptoms.
Right. So there's a couple things. First of all, there's nothing wrong with running a strict classroom. It's how you run that classroom. So if you have expectations, and I think sometimes veteran teachers are like, so I'm just supposed to let them do whatever they want to do and run wild. And it's like, no, you set expectations, but you recognize why they're not meeting those expectations. And you set up those win-then pathways so that they can develop new habits, and you infuse positivity and support in it. So it's really about the interpersonal relationship that you have in helping the kid come from the current state they're in to your desired state. And, the other thing is punishment doesn't work to change behavior or build habits. It punishes you. So sure, there's a consequence. And I'm, you can ask my kids, I'm a consequence girl. Like when they were little, if they acted out, they had a consequence, but that was secondary. It was more about like, okay, why did you do that? And what are we going to do next time? And sometimes I didn't give them a consequence if they were really remorseful and they're like, I don't know why I did it. And I was like, well, maybe we need to talk to your brain. Maybe we need to tell your brain what you want the next time instead of letting your brain direct, the part of your brain you're not controlling. And so sometimes it's not appropriate to punish. And I've been in schools before where in elementary schools where kids are getting suspensions. And I was talking to one kid who had a suspension, and because of staffing and the way they couldn't do the suspension until a Wednesday, but the behavior happened the week before. And I'm like, he's 8. He doesn't even remember last week. He's not. And so I asked him why he was, in suspension that day. He said, I have no idea. And I said, well, do you remember that you got in trouble last week? And he's like, not really, and I'm like, okay, so this is our method for changing behavior. It doesn't even make sense.
Right. No, that's so unfortunate. So unfortunate.
Yeah.
For anyone that comes across this podcast, what is the biggest takeaway you would like them to get from, I'm just leave it there. What is the biggest takeaway you'd like them to get?
Yeah. My biggest takeaway is that educators and really anybody that works with youth, our job is them, right? Our job is developing them into future ready people, into people who are aware and regulated and in control. And so my biggest takeaway for the audience is if you're 80% focused on content standards and skill standards, and you're not as focused on the people sitting in front of you, you're never going to close equity gaps. You're going to make your job harder because you're going to have at least a few students that drive you bananas every year. And if you look at it differently, if you look at the behavior as biology and context, and you control the context to set the stage for positive development, you will be so much more successful and you'll be happier, and you'll find ways to find joy in kids who are hurt. We have some kids that come to us that are very broken. And if we don't ever put the pieces back together or give them a different view that something could be different, why would we think that they would know that?
Yeah, we all come in with our different bags, with our different
And we expect other people as adults, we expect some grace and space from other people, but we don't give that grace and space to kids. And one real quick thing, because I know we're almost out of time, but one of the techniques I use is called fizzy or flat. And I tell teachers, get a can of pop and take the kids outside and shake the pop and then open it. And you say, okay, so this is carbonated. And have you ever had like soda that's too carbonated? It tastes disgusting. Or if it's flat, it tastes disgusting. You want it just right. It's like Goldilocks, right? So I can't see inside of your can. So you need to tell me if you're fizzy or flat, and then have like in the classroom, out of the classroom, like an entrance routine where the kids can come in, and if they're feeling fizzy, they can just look at you and say fizzy, and you leave them alone. Give them some grace and space to calm down. And then you teach them how to kind of calm their body. And then again, you can start to gather data on their growing sense of regulation versus gathering data on how many times a week they're coming in elevated, because that's just confirming the obvious. So the fizzy and flat thing, it gives the student a voice and a little bit of agency to be able to say, I'm allowed to ask for what I need. Like right now, you can say, when you're fizzy, how can I help? Well, I really need a hug. Okay. When you say fizzy, I'm going to give you a big hug. Or maybe I just need to go put my head down for 5 minutes and zone out to like clean my brain out. Okay. I'm not going to start haranguing you about your homework or things like that. I'll give you a little bit of grace and space. When you treat kids like humans instead of data points, and you understand what's going on up there, you can be so impactful. You can be the most important person they've ever known.
Man, I like that. Dr. Riegel, where can anyone that wants to just follow up with some of the gems that you dropped today, or just wants to follow up with any of your work, your research, or purchase the book NeuroWell, how can they find you? How can they follow you, and all of those good things?
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn, so they can just Lisa Riegel on LinkedIn. I also have a website, lisariegel.com. And then I have the site that's more school-based, because I work in private and public sector. So the school-based is EP Institute. So it's like Educational Partnerships Institute. And there's my contact information's right there. And on my Lisa Riegel website, there's a Calendly right there. They can book a meeting. I get so excited to go work with leaders who get it, who really want to make that change. And I have my other book is coming out like in the next 48 hours. It'll be available on Amazon. And it's a leadership focused book on how do you make change and how do you use the brain science to engage your staff. And I think that's something that, leaders would find valuable, because if you've got a culture among your staff that's negative, you're never going to get a culture in the school that's positive. So it kind of starts at the top. So I'd love to hear from people. They can reach out and set up a meeting to chat and or email me through the LinkedIn.
Sounds good. Dr. Riegel, thank you so much for having a conversation with me that helps to redefine education.
Thank you so much.